Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Friedrich Engels. Saint-Simon was a son of the Great French Revolution, at the outbreak of which he was not yet 30. The revolution was the victory of the Third Estate, the rest of the great masses of the nation working in production and in trade, over the privileged idle classes, the nobles and the priests. But the victory of the Third Estate soon revealed itself as exclusively the victory of a smaller part of this estate, as the conquest of political power by the socially privileged section of it, reste the property bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie has certainly developed rapidly during the Revolution, partly by speculation in the lands of the nobility and of the church, confiscated and afterwards put up for sale, and partly by frauds upon the nation by means of army contracts. It was the domination of these swindlers that, under the Directorate, brought France to the verge of ruin, and thus gave Napoleon the pretext for his coup d'etat. Hence, to Saint-Simon, the antagonism between the Third Estate and the privileged classes took the form of an antagonism between the workers and the idlers. The idlers were not merely the old privileged classes, but also all who, without taking any part in production or distribution, lived on their incomes. And the workers were not only the wage workers, but also the manufacturers, the merchants, the bankers. That the idlers had lost the capacity for intellectual leadership and political supremacy had been proved, and was by the Revolution finally settled. That the non-possessing classes had not this capacity seemed to Saint-Simon proved by the experiences of the Reign of Terror. Then, who was to lead and command? According to Saint-Simon, science and industry, both united by a religious bond, destined to restore that unity of religious ideas which had been lost since the time of the Reformation, a necessarily mystic and rigidly hierarchic new Christianity. But science, that was the scholas, and industry, that was, in the first place, the working bourgeois, manufacturers, merchants, bankers. These bourgeois were, certainly, intended by Saint-Simon to transform themselves into a kind of public officials, of social trustees, but they were still to hold vis-a-vis of the workers and commanding an economically privileged position. The bankers especially were to be called upon to direct the whole of social production by the regulation of credit. The conception was in exact keeping with a time in which modern industry in France, and with it the chasm between bourgeoisie and proletariat, was only just coming into existence. What Saint-Simon especially lays stress upon is this: what interests him first, and above all other things, is the lot of the class that is the most numerous and the most poor, la classe la plus nombreuse et la plus pauvre. Already in his Geneva letters, Saint-Simon lays down the proposition that all men ought to work. In the same work he recognizes also that the Reign of Terror was the reign of the non-possessing masses. See, says he to them, what happened in France at the time when your comrades held sway there. They brought about a famine. La thèse des inhabitants de Geneva assesse contemporains Saint-Simon 1803 Anno Domini. But to recognize the French Revolution as a class war not simply one between nobility and bourgeoisie, but between nobility, bourgeoisie, and the non-possessors, was, in the year 1802 Anno Domini, a most pregnant discovery. In 1816, he declares that politics is the science of production, and foretells the complete absorption of politics by economics. The knowledge that economic conditions are the basis of political institutions appears here only in embryo. Yet what is here already very plainly expressed is the idea of the future conversion of political rule over men into the administration of things in a direction of processes of production. It is to say, the abolition of the state, about which recently there has been so much noise. Saint-Simon shows the same superiority over his contemporaries when in 1814, immediately after the entry of the Allies into Paris, and then again in 1850, during the 100 Days' War, he proclaims the alliance of France and England, and then both of these countries with Germany, as the only guarantee for the prosperous development and peace of Europe. To preach to the French in 1815 an alliance with the victors of Waterloo required as much courage as historical foresight. If in Saint-Simon we find a comprehensive breadth of view by virtue of which almost all the ideas of later socialism are not strictly economic are found in him in embryo. We find in Fourier a criticism of the existing conditions of society, genuinely French and witty, but not upon that account any the less thorough. Fourier takes the bourgeoisie, their inspired prophets before the revolution, and their interested ideologists after it, at their own word. He lays bare remorselessly the material and moral misery of the bourgeois world. He confronts it with the earlier philosophers' dazzling promises of a society in which reason alone should reign, of a civilization in which happiness should be universal, of an illimitable human perfectibility, and with the rose-colored phraseology of the bourgeois ideologists of his time. He points out how everywhere the most pitiful reality corresponds with the most high-sounding phrases, and he overwhelms this hopeless fiasco of phrases with his mordant sarcasm. Fourier is not only a critic, his imperturbably serene nature makes him a satirist, and assuredly one of the greatest satirists of all time. He depicts with equal power and charm the swindling speculations that blossomed out upon the downfall of the revolution, and the shopkeeping spirit prevalent in, and the characteristic of, French commerce at that time. Still more masterly is his criticism of the bourgeois form of the relations between sexes, and the position of women in bourgeois society. He was the first to declare that in any given society, the degree of women's emancipation is the natural measure of the general emancipation. But Fourier is at his greatest in his conception of the history of society. He divides its whole course thus far into 4 stages of evolution: savagery, barbarism, the patriarch, civilization. The last is identical with the so-called civil or bourgeois society of the day. It is with the social order that came in with the 16th century. He proves that the civilized stage raises every vice practiced by barbarism in a simple fashion into a form of existence, complex, ambiguous, equivocal, hypocritical. That civilization moves in a vicious circle, in contradictions which it constantly reproduces without being able to solve them. Hence its it constantly arrives at the very opposite to that which it wants to attain, or pretends to want to attain. So that, exempli gratia, under civilization, poverty is born of superabundance itself. Veri de Leonat, Vasseur, Fourier, 1843, Anno Domini, and La Nouvelle Monnaie Industrielle et Sociétaire, o invasion do procede de industrio attrayante et natural disturbere in serie passionoi Fourier, 1845, Anno Domini. Fourier, as we see, uses the dialectic method in the same masterly way as his contemporary Hegel. Using these same dialectics, he argues against talk about illimitable human perfectibility, that every historical phrase has its period of ascent and also its period of descent. He applies this observation to the future of the whole human race. As Kant introduced into natural science the idea of the ultimate destruction of the earth, Fourier introduced into historical science that of the ultimate destruction of the human race. Whilst in France, the hurricane of the Revolution swept over the land, in England a quieter, but not on that account less tremendous, revolution was going on. Steam and the new tool-making machinery were transforming manufacture into minor industry, and thus revolutionizing the whole foundation of bourgeois society. The sluggish march of development on the manufacturing period changed into a veritable storm and stress period of production, with constantly increasing swiftness. The splitting up into large capitalists and non-possessing proletarians went on. Between these, instead of the former stable middle class, an unstable mass of artisans and small shopkeepers, the most fluctuating portion of the population, now led a precarious existence. The new mode of production was, as yet, only at the beginning of its period of ascent. As yet it was the normal, regular method of production, the only one possible under existing conditions. Nevertheless, even then, it was producing crying social abuses, the herding together of a homeless population in the worst quarters of the large towns, the loosening of old traditional moral bonds, of patriarchal subordination, of family relations, overwork especially of women and children, to a frightful extent, complete demoralization of the working class, suddenly flung into altogether new conditions, from the country into the town, from agriculture into mining industry, from stable conditions of existence into insecure ones that change from day to day. At this juncture there came forward as a reformer and manufacturer 29 years old, a man almost sublime, childlike simplicity of character, and at the same time one of the few born leaders of men. Robert Owen had adopted the teaching of the materialistic philosophers, that man's character is the product, on the one hand, of hereditary, on the other, of the environment of the individual during his lifetime, and especially during his period of development. In the Industrial Revolution, most of his class saw only chaos and confusion, and the opportunity fishing in these troubled waters and making large fortunes quickly. He saw in it the opportunity of putting into practice his favorite theory, and so of bringing order out of chaos. He had already tried it with success as superintendent of more than 500 men in a Manchester factory. From 1800 to 1829 Anno Domini, he directed the great cotton mill at New Lanark in Scotland as managing partner, along the same lines, but with greater freedom of action and with a success that made him a European reputation. A population originally consisting of the most diverse and, for the most part, very demoralized elements, a population that gradually grew to 2,500. He turned into a model colony in which drunkenness, police, magistrates, lawsuits, poor laws, charity were unknown. And all this simply by placing the people in conditions worthy of human beings, and especially by carefully bringing up the rising generation. He was a founder of infant schools and introduced them first in New Lanark. At the age of 2, the children came to school, where they enjoyed themselves so much that they could scarcely be got home again, whilst his competitors worked their people 13 or 14 hours a day. In New Lanark, the working day was only 10.5 hours. When a crisis in Caen stopped work for 4 months, his workers received their full wages all the time. And with all this, the business more than doubled in value, and to the last yielded large profits to its proprietors. In spite of all this, Owen was not content. The existence which he secured for his workers was, in his eyes, still far from being worthy of human beings. The people were slaves at my mercy. The relatively favorable conditions in which he had placed them were still far from allowing a rational development of the character and of the intellect in all directions, much less of the free exercise of all their faculties. And yet, the working part of this population of 2,500 persons was daily producing as much real wealth for society as, less than half a century before, it would have required the working part of a population of 600,000 to create. I asked myself, what became of the difference between the wealth consumed by 2,500 persons and that which had been consumed by 600,000? The answer was clear. It had been used to pay the proprietors of the establishment 5% on the capital they had laid out, in addition to over £300,000 clear profit, and that which held for New Lanark held to a still greater extent for all the factories in England. If this new wealth had not been created by machinery imperfectly as it had been applied, the wars of Europe in opposition to Napoleon and to support the aristocratic principles of society could not have been maintained. And yet this new power was the creation of the working classes. To them, therefore, the fruits of this new power belonged. The newly created gigantic productive forces, hitherto used only to enrich individuals and to enslave the masses, offered to Owen the foundations for a reconstruction of society. They were destined, as the common property of all, to be worked for the common good of all. Owen's communism was based upon this purely business foundation, the outcome, so to say, of commercial calculation. Throughout, it maintained this practical character. Thus, in 1823 on a Domine, Owen proposed the relief of the distress in Ireland by communist colonies, and drew up complete estimates of costs of founding them, yearly expenditure, and probable revenue. And in his definite plan for the future, the technical working out of details is managed with such practical knowledge, ground plan, front and side, and bird's eye's view all included, that the Owen method of social reform, once accepted, there is from the practical point of view little to be said against the actual arrangement of details. His advance in the direction of communism was the turning point in Owen's life. As long as he was simply a philanthropist, he was rewarded with nothing but wealth, applause, honor, and glory. He was the most popular man in Europe, Not only men of his own class, but the statesmen and princes listened to him approvingly. But when he came out with his communist theories, that was quite another thing. These great obstacles seemed to him especially to block the path to social reform, private property, religion, and the present form of marriage. He knew what confronted him if he attacked these: outlawry, excommunication from official society, the loss of his whole social position. But nothing of this prevented him from attacking them without fear of consequences. And what he had foreseen happened. Banished from official society, with a conspiracy of silence against him in the press, ruined by his unsuccessful communist experiments in America, in which he sacrificed all his fortune, he turned directly to the working class and continued working in their midst for 30 years. Every social movement, every real advance in England on behalf of the workers links itself on to the name of Robert Owen. He forced through in 1819 Anno Domini, after 5 years fighting, the first law limiting the hours of labor of women and children in factory. He was president of the first Congress at which all the trade unions of England united in a single great trade association. He introduced as transition measures to the complete communistic organization of society, on the one hand, cooperative societies for retail and production. These have since that time, at least, given practical proof that the merchant and the manufacturer are socially quite unnecessary. On the other hand, he introduced labor bazaars for the exchange of the products of labor through the medium of labor notes, whose unit was a single hour of work, institutions necessarily doomed to failure, but completely anticipating Proudhon's Bank of Exchange of a much later period, and differing entirely from this in that it did not claim to be the best panacea for all social ills, but only a first step towards a much more radical revolution of society. The Utopian's mode of thought has for a long time governed the socialist ideas of the 19th century, and still governs some of them. Until very recently, all French and English socialists did homage to it. The earlier German communism, including that of Weitling, was of the same school. To all these, socialism is the expression of absolute truth, reason, and justice, and has only to be discovered to conquer all the world by virtue by its own power. And as an absolute truth is independent of time, space, and of the historical development of man, it is a mere accident when and where it is discovered. With all this, absolute truth, reason, and justice are different with the founder of each different school, as each one's special kind of absolute truth, reason, and justice is again conditioned by his subjective understanding, his conditions of existence, the measure of his knowledge, and his intellectual training. There is no other ending possible in this conflict of absolute truths than that they shall be mutually exclusive of one another. Hence, from this nothing could come but a kind of eclectic average socialism, which, as a matter of fact, has up to the present time dominated the minds of most of the socialist workers in France and England. Hence, a mishmash allowing of the most manifold shades of opinion, a mishmash of such critical statements, economic theories, pictures of future society by the founders of different sects, to succeed a minimum of opposition, a mishmash which was the more easily brewed, the more definite sharp edges of the individual constituents are rubbled down in the stream of the wheat, like rounded pebbles in a brook. To make a science of socialism, they have first to be placed upon a real basis.